And in the second hour, Mark Freud joins the programme. Mark's an independent scholar, and he wrote a book a short time ago called The Lost Child, which studies the figure of the lost child in English-speaking and European literature and culture. Mark's wife Liz sent me a blog posting by Mark about Stranger Things, which is a hugely successful Netflix programme and a show that I'm a big fan of. Mark's blog post on Stranger Things is pinned to the top of our Facebook page. If you haven't read it, check it out. Mark will talk about that and more in the second hour. All the rest of it. Now, Hayden Hewitt has been banging on for years about the need for people to have their own blogs, their own space on the internet, so that people who want to find them can find them, so that they're not buried under an avalanche of shadow banning by Facebook and Twitter. So what's that all about, really? Well, it means that to get something out to people, to speak to people, don't post it to Facebook, have a blog. And we were talking about, you know, the proof then, not so much the proof, but it's then put up to content creators like us when people do that, and when they've got something interesting or exciting to say, and they should be featured. And I was dropped a message the other day by a lady called Liz Freud. Liz is a listener to the programme, and she sent me a link to an article by her husband Mark. It's a brilliant article. I shared it on Twitter and on Facebook. It's about Stranger Things, the television series, but it's about a lot more than that. Stranger things have happened, Hollywood abuse and what we have lost. The link is to lostchildmarkfreud.blogspot.co.uk. And Mark's a very interesting man indeed. He's the author of a book called The Lost Child in Literature and Culture, which was published last year, and it's of great interest to us considering the things we talk about on this programme. As I said, he's an academic. The book is about the lost child in English-speaking and European literature and culture, and it argues that the lost child figure is of profound importance for our society. It's a symptom as well as a cause of deep trauma. I'm looking forward to reading that book, but I'm delighted to welcome to the programme the man himself, Mark Freud. Mark, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well, Richie. It's wonderful to be here.
Brilliant stuff. Terrific article.
Thank you.
So when you began watching this Stranger Things TV show, which we did last year, we for our sins subscribed to Netflix. It came on. He said, right, we'll give it a go. We thought it was outstanding, and because of interviewing people like Stuart Swerdlow and obviously David and others, and talking about Montauk, and of course we've had Kathy O'Brien on, it began to speak to me. But as a narrative, it really spoke to you, that television show, right?
It did. I guess it brought a lot of things together. The fact that it started with a child who got lost, in this case to a completely different dimension, and it was talking about disruptions of time. The way it was set in the 1980s sort of flashback to when I was a child as well, sort of spoke to me a bit. The references to the films there. But I think as soon as I started watching it with Liz, and then they actually referenced MK Ultra as well, it started to resonate with lots of other things, and thinking about I started to look into it and found out about the Montauk project and stories about that. And what I'm not sure if it's true or not, but just the fact that we know it's been admitted to that MK Ultra happened, maybe still happening, but it was admitted to anyway by Clinton. So if the government's going to admit to something, then there's a lot more besides that's hidden. That's
you might get 5% of it, right? If the government is admitting it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I want to ask you, Mark? And we've got loads of time, by the way. We've got as much time as we need for the rest of this hour. Fascinating that reading about you in the last couple of days already. I'm going to order your book and I'm going to read it. But you've got me very interested in a book that seems to have had a big impact on you when you went to uni. And it's a book that I never read, but I've always been aware of its existence, but I never read it. A book by a man called Ian McEwan called The Child in Time, which I understand, Mark, is a fictional story, but it deals with elements of obviously losing a child, not losing a child to death, but losing a child as in a child going missing, but also elements of time travel. Give us the Cliff Note version of what that book is about and why it meant so much to you.
I think it struck a chord because it encapsulated so much and all around this absent child. It's a story of someone whose child was abducted in a supermarket some years before, and there's obviously symbolism with that because it was written in the 1980s, and it's obviously a critique of the Thatcher government of the time, but it's set in the near future, sort of a bit advanced from when it was written. And it refers to a prime minister in the book anyway. It refers to a prime minister, but doesn't actually specify the gender. So it's having a little bit of a dig there at Margaret Thatcher, possibly. But it was the way that the lost child figure seemed to be at the centre of a book that was criticising what was happening politically and socially at that time. But then it also had lots of other references to quantum physics, and that was something that I hadn't really read into much before I read that book. And I guess I'd always been someone who was always looking at literature and the arts, and science to me just seemed in the sort of William Blake way of viewing it as being a way of constricting reality or quantifying it, putting it into numbers. I think that was a bit of a Philistine view on my part. But when I started to hear about quantum physics and look in that, and it links quantum physics with spirituality in the book, and that really interested me because quantum physics seemed to be saying a lot of similar things in a hard science or hard mathematics sort of a way that spiritual religions had said for centuries, like Buddhism and Hinduism. And again, and also within that, there was lots of talk about time and how time was flexible, was not linear, how we perceived it, normal clock time, day to day. And there's a particular strong central scene in the book where the main character, Stephen, who's lost his daughter years ago, Stephen is going to meet his estranged wife, and he has a sort of, he sees a pub which he doesn't remember ever going to before, but it seems strangely familiar, and he looks in the window and he can see a young woman who he sort of knows is his mother as a young woman, and she looks at him and he has a sort of passes out and then wakes up sort of with his estranged wife, and then he later talks to his mother and she tells him about a story when she was having a trip with her husband to be and stopped in this pub, and they were talking about aborting the child, and then she said she saw an apparition of a baby in the window and knew it was going to be her son, so she didn't abort the child. I don't know, it just, to me, it was quite striking in a very realistic novel and a very realistic writer that included a scene like that, and it just seemed to collapse everything into one book.
And it had a profound effect on you because you started to think about these things then, about whether time is relative, whether it's linear, which has obviously informed the article anyway. I mean, I've not read your book yet, but it's informed the article. And I want to talk, and I'm terrible for going off in tangents, so give me a smack and say...
I'm obviously like that myself.
No, it's brilliant. It's great speaking with you. So, by the way, when I say the article is brilliant, it's brilliant. You're a terrific writer. Thank God that you've started the blog. And this is the way forward. I mean, I'd never have heard of you if Liz, your wife, hadn't said, look, my husband is an academic, he's an author, he's written this article. It is brilliant, and it's dealing with really important themes about the nature of reality, where we are. I'm speaking with Mark Freud. Mark is an author, an academic, great guy. Great to have him on. This article about the relationship between Stranger Things and events that may or may not have happened. Obviously, I think they did. the Montauk Project. I've spoken to people about that, the kidnapping of children, experiments, remote viewing, other dimensions, that sort of stuff. It's incredible. And this goes back to Mark reading a book when he was at uni in his first year, this Ian McEwan book, which I've already ordered. And I can't wait for it to arrive because I've not read it before. I really can't. Now, this is fascinating. You talk in your article about the lost child throughout history, throughout our culture. Why, and this is a ridiculous question to ask because I suppose we could be here all night, but why is we almost have an obsession with the loss of children? Now, when I say we almost have an obsession, I was in Spain when Madeleine McCann went missing, and I was beginning to get back into serious commercial radio there. And okay, the media stirred a lot of it up, but in general, people were absolutely overcome by it. We saw the same when Jamie Bulger was murdered many years ago by Venables and the other guy. Is there something going on? Forget about who's kidnapping children for a minute and who's doing things to them. The effect it has on society, Mark, the trauma that it seems to have on cultures and society. You're fascinated by this, right?
I am. Well, obviously, I'm initially looking for it mainly from books, films, how it's represented there, and when there's characters of lost children there. And so often it seems to be that writers use a lost child figure to symbolise when society's broken down and when they were questioning what was happening in the society. I guess because a child is portrayed as being an innocent figure. So maybe it's something that we've lost within ourselves, or society's lost. If children can be mistreated, abducted, killed, it tells us something about the state we're in as a nation, as a society. But it's interesting. There's a flip side as well, because we are obsessed with it, and it keeps coming up all the time in culture. And obviously, those tragic cases that you mentioned, which have been throughout the media, continually ever since they happened. But tragically, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of children that go missing every year. And of course, 99% of those, they don't receive any coverage at all, hardly, if at all. And it's interesting that certain cases, and admittedly, some horrific cases, I'm not saying they shouldn't get any attention, but it seems like the media chooses to highlight certain cases and make such a huge thing about them that they dominate the media, and they create an image that seems then to obscure so much else that goes on, and all these hundreds of thousands of children that do go missing. And as you know, which I didn't really appreciate so much when I wrote the book, but having read or listened to more alternative media since, and and obviously talk about paedophile rings has become
By the way, Mark, I haven't, because some of my listeners might think Richie's lost the point here. I haven't lost the point. I'm fascinated by you exploring the metaphor of the lost child and how it's a metaphor for the breakdown of society. That's brilliant. It's cutting edge stuff, really, and it's above my head. But I'm fascinated by it, and I'm going to read more about it. How this, through the centuries, we can see this, and your work on that. I can't wait to get into it. But at the same time, as well as it being a metaphor used in cultural literature and all of that, it is going on at the same time. It's physically going on, and it going on has had, or continues to have some sort of psychological effect on society at large. And I'm very interested in that as well. And I suppose that's where Stranger Things comes in, Mark. Have we lost Mark momentarily? We have. It's gone quiet there. We'll give him a call back. This is fascinating stuff, this. Mark Freud was on the line momentarily. I think he's back now. Let's give him a call back there. He's an academic and an author. We lost you momentarily, Mark.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. It could be me. I was chatting away to myself there for a minute. I realised you were gone. That happens to me all the time. I'm talking away and I realise that people have left the room. Lovely. No, but I was making a point. I'm fascinated by the use of the lost child as a metaphor for bad times and for for the ills of society throughout the ages, which is a very interesting area of research, and I can't wait to read your book. But at the same time, of course, lots and lots of children go missing. You made the point in the article. You talked about, some of the most notorious examples of the terrible mistreatment of children, through, Roma children, through the Catholic Church, the horrible story about Franco and all the babies. I mean, you could have talked about Ireland as well, Kolkata in India. And this is having some profound, wider psychological effect on society. Is it fair to say that? Do you look into that? Is that something you're interested in?
I am interested. Yeah, I mean, it is a communal trauma, I think, but maybe in the way of some, when they talk about individuals having trauma, and they repress the memories of something that happened to them. It seems in a lot of ways that's what we do as a society, because a lot of those things that you mentioned were obviously suppressed, even though so many people knew that they went on in the different places where it was happening. It went on for decades. And something like child migration, where thousands of children went from homes in Britain to the colonies, former colonies, and often terribly mistreated. And it just wasn't spoken about, and people didn't know about it until the Child Migrant Trust under Margaret Humphrey started to sort of investigate it. And I remember seeing the film about it, Oranges and Sunshine, by I think Ken Loach's son. And when someone first approached her about it, she said, well, it can't be a thing. Obviously the government wouldn't have allowed this to happen, or it would have come out by now that this terrible thing was happening, and the government was allowing all these kids to be shipped over the other side of the world, and and just forgotten about, really. But it wasn't, and it's I don't know. It seems to be like we've buried. I'm sorry to use terrible sort of metaphorical language when we're talking about real tragic occurrences, but we've buried this lost child sort of underneath the foundations that we've built our society on, and that's why it just shows what a shallow or what a terrible structure that's built around us, because underneath it is this lost child which we're denying, whether it's something in ourselves that we've repressed, or I think a lot when I talk about time, the figure of the lost child strikes a chord, because a child is supposed to be a promise of the future and hold so much hope, and at the same time it maybe reminds us of when we were children and what we were like then, or what we were our past. And so it's some sort of disruption. And when a child goes missing, a child that obviously should grow for many years to come, it somehow disrupts the idea we have of time, about a linear time of just a child being born and growing up and living its life. It's just it just seems that it just shows that the child migration thing, the very origins I mentioned in my article, was back in the 17th century, when kids used to be rounded up off the streets, and they used to call it spiriting, a sort of press gang thing.
Tell us more about that, Mark. Stay with this for a minute, because you talk about this in the article. Talk to us about spiriting. Let me just remind the listeners there, it's 1:30 the hour. Time is bloody well flying, as it does whenever I'm fascinated by my guests, and I'm generally fascinated by all of our guests. I'm not being a politician here. I'm not. But tonight I'm absolutely riveted, because I've read Mark's article several times, and I've been reading about him online. I can't wait to read this book that Mark published last year. Talk to us about spiriting, because our listeners, many of them won't have heard the term. What happened? Tell us about this.
Well, it goes back to as I say, I think 1618, the first sort of kids were rounded up, and it was actually by the City of London, which rather again sort of strikes a chord with what David Ice talks about how the City of London is at the centre of so much. But it went on. The Aberdeen in Scotland was a big centre of it, and I think Bristol as well was a port where a lot well, I suppose you'd call it trafficked. Were trafficked from in modern language, but a lot of the kids from poor families, and that's something that resonates throughout all these stories up to the modern day. It's you know, up to when you're talking about forced adoptions. Maybe now it seems to be the children from families that are considered sort of poor or undesirable some way seem to be the ones. It's some sort of social cleansing thing. I think you mentioned that term before. But back in the 17th century, yeah, these kids were just sort of rounded up by ruffians, I guess, and carted off on ships to America. Then that was the principal colony, to work as slaves almost. I think a lot of them they called indentured, so they had maybe a period of so many years when they had to work basically as a sort of slave for one of the farmers, plantation owners on the colony.
The Virginia Company, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then after a certain period of time, I think some of them were, you know, they were freed, or they were allowed to then own their own property. But obviously they'd been ripped away from their families, you know.
With the collusion of the City of London at the time, Mark. That's
right. Yeah, which is very striking. And then, and certainly it was big business. There was a famous guy, Peter Williamson, I think it was called, Indian Peter, he got known as, and he actually, again, he may have embellished his own story a bit, but no doubt he was abducted from around Aberdeen in, I think, the 17th or early 18th century, and he was taken off to the colonies. He ended up that he was freed, and then he fought in wars, and but he actually came back, and he actually managed to make it all the way back up to Aberdeen, and he actually sued the merchants of the town that had been colluding in sending these kids abroad. So right from those early days, you've got children being adopted as being central to corporations, if you like, to big business. It was, and to the building blocks of the empire. They were, you know, in the more recent child migration in the 20th century. Some people, you know, refer to these poor kids as more sort of material for the forge, you know, more to build the empire, because they wanted to populate the colonies with white children, but they were taking them from poor families, and in a more modern form, it was from a lot of religious institutions. Maybe some of them, you know, probably maybe well-meaning in a way at the time, but at the same time, it was this misguided idea that, yeah, I mean, because a lot of these children had, you know, their parents were still alive. They maybe just were poor, couldn't cope with their kids, so they'd gone in basically orphanages. But then the kids were taken away, and they were often told that their parents had died when they hadn't. Letters that the children tried to write, or that the parents wrote to them, you know, whenever they never found the other person. You know, absolute terrible tragedies that, you know, holes were ripped out of people. And
so I have a question. I have a question on this then. This is just extraordinary. So if this is going on throughout history, and it has done, and it's gone on under the direction of those who are sworn to protect and uphold the law, it must imprint on our consciousness, and it must be passed on. It must be, right?
I think so, yeah.
This is where you're going with this. So here we are in 2018, and this is going on. I mean, I was riveted when you were talking about Jim Loach's film and it going on under the noses of people. I could testify to that in the Republic of Ireland, with obviously what was going on, the church, Christian Brothers, the nuns, all of that, domestic abuse of children, which I have experience with. This is going on, and through the generations, this is imprinted on our what we are, our consciousness. If we are this conscious vibrational beings, and it is doing something to us. And time not being linear is related to this in some way as well. Right?
I think so. I mean, it is the Lost Child. Hello?
I'm with you. I'm listening to you, Mark.
Oh, okay. And just got a little tune. Yeah, it's. I think like I say, the lost child figure certainly in the books, the plays, the films that I talked about in my book, that the lost child figure, it disrupts something about how we see the world and also our perception of time. And I think where it comes back to Stranger Things, maybe this idea of other dimensions and what is reality. I think the lost child figure questions that as well. I mean, just on a material level, it questions how, we let the politicians do what they do, or we let the structures of society control us. But I think there is something a bit more profound. Also, apart from just lost children, I write about where a lot of writers have talked about mute children that don't speak, or that or feral children that are outside language, because that's the real, I suppose, almost one of the most basic ways we structure our society is through language. I heard Max Egan actually talking on his broadcast recently, saying about writing, about it being spelling literally, and it's this way of writing out thing. It's like the law. It's a sort of a basic way of controlling and setting out the structures of society. So I think, again, in a lot of the works that I've looked at, there's a silent child, which is sort of a silent witness, and it's outside language, and it connects to something spiritual. This, what you were talking about with, was it Mark? Last night,
Mark Boyarsky. Yeah,
and connects. I mean, it's such a tragic thing, but I think there's sort of it could connect hopefully to the fact that there is this spiritual consciousness that lies beyond and sort of underneath everything, and if there is as Mark was talking about, if there's any way out of where we are, this sort of trap, although the lost child is such a tragedy, if there's any way of healing it, it's maybe just trying to connect to that spiritual, whatever it is, beyond our material reality.
Let me just do a quick recap, Mark. Mark's book is The Lost Child in Literature and Culture. If you look that up online, you'll find it. But the blog that Mark writes can be read at lostchildmarkfreud.blogspot.co.uk. Mark's an academic and an author. Wrote a terrific article. I mean, it's one of the best articles I've read in a long time, after watching with his wife Liz, Stranger Things, which many people have seen by now. It's just finished its second season. Remarkable story. And we've covered a lot in the time that we've been speaking. And Mark's been talking about the lost child through history and through our cultures. And this is extremely fascinating. It really is. And how it's been used as a metaphor to describe, I suppose, the basest, not so much instincts, but the worst of society, when society's been broken, when things have been very bad. We've gotten into talking about how this has had a profound effect on the consciousness, our collective consciousness, over generations, and what it might have done or be doing to us, the way we think and the way we understand the world. It's terrific stuff, Mark. And I'm thinking somewhere along the line then, you've got to throw into the mix, if there was an elevation in consciousness that could deal with the damage that is done psychologically and physically to children, what might that mean for us in terms of liberating us in the way we think and in the way things are, even in the way we might be able to change things? Or am I going too far there?
Well, no, I mean, I guess I'm an optimist at heart. So I think, again, it's maybe this idea of there being a lost child within all of us. So if somehow we can connect back to that, to make ourselves whole, so each individual whole, and then the indivisible whole as one consciousness. I mean, it's that's obviously, I guess, what we all want. But well, I say we all want, but yeah, I think that's there is something missing inside us, and I sort of finished my book by saying it may seem trite, but any lost child for whatever reason, whether the child's run away or if the child's been abducted, is to do with an absence of love. Whether it's caused someone to do something terrible to a child, or it's caused the child to run away because they feel unloved. And yeah, if I guess that is something our whole world has, is absence of love. So the only way to heal it and heal ourselves is going back again to what Mark Bayersky said yesterday, is really just trying to love and heal with each other and the community, really. But
there's so many pressures on that, of course, today. I agree with this, and I like where this is going. We don't have children. I know I've been saying this for a long time on the programme, but we've lived a crazy life, and we'd like to have children as old as we're getting now. But I know that the relationships that people have with their children in 2017, 2018 is nothing compared to the relationship 30, 40 years ago. People are finding it terribly difficult to have the proper relationship with their children because life gets in the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm a proud stepdad now to Caleb and Connor, but I haven't children myself. But it's there are obviously all these creative pressures. I mean, I read recently a sociologist, I think he is, Chris Jenks, and he was talking about, well, he wrote back in the 1990s, the book I was reading, but he was already talking about structures from the age of the child, schools and other pressures that are starting at the young age to start that control on people.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how guilt is somehow internalized, and so this sort of idea of a 24-hour surveillance, we've internalized it, and that's in the 1990s, just as the internet and all the rest of it was just sort of starting off, and now it's a million times worse now because you've got kids on social media and everyone sort of they're judging themselves on the basis of these images of how people are sort of shown as they should look and that sort of thing. So there's all these other pressures apart from anything external. In terms of like built structures like a school or that sort of thing. So you're right. It's terrible. It's I'm starting to think more and more from things that I've heard, listened to your program and people I've talked to about that. So much of it seems to be constructed deliberately to restrict us. And while these terrible cases of children being abducted is maybe in some way the extreme of it's sort of a thing for every child, every person, that they've got this constriction in them that is stopping them realizing their true, that this love, this connection to the spiritual, and it's being taken further away. And
I'm listening to this with mouth on the floor. I mean, the time is just flying by, and I'm thinking more and more that I have to believe that there's been, through the generations, an agenda to do this, to disrupt this by, through the sexual abuse of children, the disappearing of children. I can't not discount. I have to consider that. I can't discount it. In fact, I'd be a liar if I didn't just admit that I believe that's, the way it is and the way it has been. And you talked in your article about people like Richie Allen and others who are questioning the solidity of the world and the reality of the world, and whether or not it's a simulation. And it's just mind-blowing stuff, really, to be considering and to be connecting those subjects, the abuse of children, the forgetting of children, as well as you've discussed, and how that might all be related. Do you ever think, Mark, that it's just a minefield? That how do you even begin to sit down with somebody and talk about that? Or in your case, how do you even begin to write about that? Where the hell do you start? So much of it is theory, and yet deep down you really suspect that it's not theory. You kind of have a feeling that it's not theory. Do we know the answers? Do we have the answers, do you think, inside us? Do we know the truth? Mark Bayersky said this last night. He said, we know the answers. we've forgotten them, or they've been drilled out of us, or we've been tampered with in a way that we don't remember stuff. Do we inherently know the truth, do you think?
I guess I would like to think so. I haven't, although I guess I'm someone that's always come from things in terms of reading about them in books rather than having an intense, intimate connection with them, like some people that have a real spiritual connection to them. So I guess I haven't quite felt that really to a great extent, but I do think that everyone is capable of it, and I think that all our reality is just a manifestation of this nothingness, if you like, which is this spiritual plane, maybe. So yes, I think the answer to that, I think it is. I guess it is within us, because we're all from this same manifesting from this same plane. So it must all be within us. So I would.
Whatever the origin is, yeah. Whatever the origin is, we've obviously made up. We obviously have made up, and will make up, and do make up some part of it. So therefore, that information must be there. It's mind blowing stuff. The idea that our perception of reality could be manipulated through, the lost child. The trauma of children. I know that what you've been talking about is not just about that. I know it's only one aspect of it. I don't want you to think that I've missed the point. I've not. People always do that, though, don't they, Mark? They pick out bits of information that make sense to them, but I try not to do that. I am really fascinated by the cultural telling of that story of the lost child, and how it has been used as a metaphor. And I'm absolutely fascinated by your interest in Stranger Things and Montauk and all these other things as well. It's incredible. It sounds to me like in the last few years, profound changes have happened to you, in terms of how you see things. And I mean, you did the academic thing. You're obviously an excellent writer. Mm-hmm. You have to work for a living like everybody else. I know you do that as well. But somewhere along the line, things have changed for you. I'm right in saying that, right?
Well, yes. I've got to thank Liz for sort of turning me onto all the different alternative media and what's known as conspiracy theories, but it's good to get different perspectives. I always, I guess, had an interest in things without going too deeply into why it was, but I had interest, from a kid in sort of space and ancient civilizations, and always felt that there was a more spiritual side to being, to life than just the here and now and the sort of material world that we see around us. So I always thought that was the case, and I always certainly didn't like or trust what was done by people in charge. So I suppose it wasn't a huge step from that to then hearing about things that weren't in the mainstream, and to me it just sort of opened up a huge amount of extra information and research, which seemed to connect into what I'd already written about academically, really, through literature and the arts, and it was just sort of taking it to a different level and a different perspective on it, really. So I think that's a good way to be, because things can be closed off, whether it's at universities or that sort of thing. That there is. I may feel like I have to be wary in writing academically about things that I couldn't prove materially, but I guess that's why I like writing about literature and the arts, because you can talk about the imagination, you can talk about the spiritual in terms of what those creative authors have done. But I'd like to sort of get my own creative word out there as well. I've got a sort of novel in the pipeline, which I might sort of self-publish to avoid sort of trying to bang my head against a brick wall with the sort of publishing world. And,
but
I think the power of the imagination is a great thing, really. But it's good. Definitely, you need to try and look outside the barriers that are put around you, and try and see a wider perspective. And I certainly think people should should pay serious attention to the many sort of researchers, the people you've had on your show, because obviously they are, many of them have been working for decades on their particular fields. And I remember seeing an interview on the BBC ages ago when David Icke was sort of stitched up a little bit, and Michael Portillo was there, and he just sort of closed it all off saying conspiracy theorists are lazy or something like that, which
that's right.
Rather,
but David turned the tables on him pretty quickly, didn't he? David said, "Have you read the book?" And Portillo said no, and he said, "Well, how would you know then?" It's typical arrogance of the system and the establishment. I mean, what a lousy bastard! What a stupid thing to say. Oh, it's lazy. It's lazy journalism. Yeah.
The laziness is obviously not looking outside of what you're fed by the mainstream media. That's the lazy position, if you like. So to look further and to look into other perspectives, can take a lot of work. But and obviously it's a difficult position to be in for a lot of those people because they're ridiculed. But I think everyone's just got to find their own. You said about picking little bits of things out, but I think that's what we all do in life. We all write our own stories, and that's why literature, books can reveal things about real life, or what we consider to be real life, because that's what we base our life on. We base our life on stories, whether it's just telling someone down the road, what we did yesterday and who was
a really good point.
It's all about stories and language. Is how we construct the world. So, through that, I think we can maybe get an insight into something a bit deeper, maybe. But I think I always try and bring my work back, like with the blog, to things that have happened to real people, to real cases, because I think you've got to get a balance of the two. Look to the
Well, you do. Look, you do. There's a friend of mine, Daniel, who was talking earlier on about the depopulation agenda. And when I was speaking with Barry Trower, Daniel was saying the point that's being missed here is the depopulation agenda. And I said to him, look, nobody's missing that point. Go and tell your next door neighbour that the rollout of 5G is to kill her and all her family. They're not going to listen to you. You can't do that. You've got to meet people halfway when you're asking them to consider things that they might think are far out. I've learned to do that, not to be dogmatic and to say, well, look, have a think about this, or did you hear what this guy said, or did you hear what this woman said? The point about taking bits out that make sense to you. You can do that with people. I'll know somebody who might think that Jim Marrs and David Icke and the rest are all crazy. But I know that there are elements of your excellent article that will mean something to them. And I can show it to them and say, well, have a look at that. And you open a door by doing that, Mark, we're just about out of time. I can't believe it. It's absolutely flown by. I want to mention again, Mark wrote The Lost Child in Literature and Culture. I can't swear by it because I haven't read it, but I've ordered it and I am going to read it. And I'll be letting you know in due course. But do go to lostchildmarkfreud.blogspot.co.uk. I've tweeted a link to it already. Read that brilliant article. It's indexed. There are references there and links to his sources. It's typical. It's great journalism. It really is. And this is the way forward, Get away from Facebook. If you've got the ability to write like that and you've got something to say, do what Mark did and share that with people. A big shout out to your wife Liz for getting in touch, Mark. Sincere thanks for coming on, mate. That article meant a lot to me, and I look forward to reading you in the future and speaking to you again in the near future on the programme. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Richie, and for getting the article out there. I really appreciate it. It's fantastic.
It was an honour, mate. Thanks for that. Great stuff. Mark Freud there, and Liz, who I'm sure was listening or would have been listening to that, for sending me the article. Brilliant stuff. Check it out. I've tweeted it and it's been on Facebook, shared with other people. Marvellous stuff. That's just about it for the programme. I'm right out of time this Wednesday. Thanks to Barry Trower for coming on in the first. Remarkable man. Love Barry and what Barry does. We'll get him back on again within about 10 or 12 days. We'll have that phone in with questions for Barry. And you've just been listening to Mark Freud, an author and academic, talking about the lost child through history, through our culture, how it's been used in literature and our culture as a metaphor for bad times and the worst of times. But he also talked about and expanded into areas where how it has impacted and affected our psyche, our consciousness, the terrible things that have been done to children, how it's impacted our understanding of time and how we understand reality. He's somebody worth keeping an eye on, I think, Mark Freud. We'll certainly do that. Thanks to Simon Stewart for looking after the YouTube channel.